All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective, and that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure-to-pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity, but to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy, or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
Mollie, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited to put you out of business. That's the goal today, is no more clients for you, because we're going to solve everyone's challenges with succession planning. That's our topic for today. But before we jump into succession planning, for those who don't know you, Mollie Mitchell, could you tell us just a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do and why you're passionate about succession planning?
Well, I'm one of the oldest people in the executive search business in this particular sector. So I don't know if that is for better or worse. I'm going to try to make it for better. But I've been doing executive search for charter schools since 2007. So it's been quite a while. And during that time, I have worked with a lot of boards who honestly were pretty clueless. And it's not cheap to work with an executive search firm. And oftentimes what we end up seeing, I'd say about 50% of the time, is that there is an internal candidate who may end up getting the job. And so the question is, was that a waste of money? Was it good use of the board's time? Sometimes I don't know that it is to use these expensive search firms, and a search takes 4 to 6 months. So look, if I can help some of these boards, particularly with standalone one to two charter schools that just don't have a ton of additional cash, put that money towards something that's going to go directly to students or incenting teachers. Dang, that's a way better use of money than hiring me. I'm just going to go to Paris.
Mollie wants to be in Paris, people. Come on.
Exactly.
All right.
And people are helping fund that. But look, I think we can do better.
I love it. All right. So we can do better. And let's get into that a little bit. So you said 2007. I'm not good at public math. That's almost 20 years of executive search. And so some lessons learned there from working with boards you mentioned who maybe just didn't really know what they were getting into or found themselves in a situation where they needed help, which is really where I thought would be an interesting place to start the conversation, which is, what's the catalyst for your work? When a school or a charter network needs a new CEO, when and why do they find you? A lot of people might think, oh, it's natural. CEOs don't stay forever. But talk us through some of the natural scenarios where a succession plan needs to be in place. Like, why does someone come to you?
Well, a lot of times we're coming in to replace the founder, right? So that's one very common scenario. And sometimes it's because the founder has decided to move on. And sometimes it's because the board has decided the founder should move on. So it's not always mutual. I've had this happen. For the first time in my 17 years of doing this, we got approached by a board whose CEO died.
Wow.
Of COVID.
Oh my goodness.
Just last year. So not even COVID during COVID, just last year. And they were without a CEO for a year.
Wow.
Right? While they went through the process and did the search, and we helped them hire someone externally who I think is gotten off to an amazing start. But that was hard to talk about when they called and said, look, Because I ask them, why are you calling me?
Right.
Like, what got you to this point? Right? I want to know. The first time in 17 years, they said, our CEO passed away. And so, do you need an emergency succession plan? You do. There's some harsh realities about life, right? Sometimes may not be the founder. There's a CEO in place again who decides to move on, or eventually a board may just decide to push the person out. They're just for being ineffective. And so it goes both ways. Like, if this is going to be a positive thing, everybody's like, yeah, this person's leaving and we support them and we're going to try to find a new person. Or this is a turnaround. We are at the bottom academically. We can't go one more year without seeing some upward momentum. So sometimes it's not under the best of circumstances.
Got it. So there's a variety of potential scenarios that you find yourself in. I would imagine, I mean, this is just a guess, but I would imagine most organizations, when they decide to bring in outside help, regardless of the catalyst, they've probably, that board or whoever's responsible for the hiring has probably already decided that nobody internally is qualified or is a good fit at the point at which they're saying we need to bring in outside help. How often do you find boards are completely skipping over internal candidates?
I think the sad truth is that the boards don't know who is strong internally. They are really evaluating their CEO or their executive director, and nonprofit boards, this is not their day job. This is, a side deal. And so for them to really understand the talent, the depth of the bench and who's on the bench, I find that to be really unusual for a board. So when we come in, and I always say, is there an internal candidate? Well, maybe. We've heard that so-and-so is good, but we're not sure. So they don't know. And when we come in and do kind of our due diligence, where we spend a couple days on campus or the campuses and talk to a bunch of different stakeholders, it will materialize if there is a person internally who has broad support. And sometimes that's a surprise to the board. Or the board may just be going with whoever the CEO, the outgoing CEO or executive director says, I think this is the best person to succeed me. Now, why? And I could tell you a whole story about how that didn't work in a big CMO in Texas, because the board just took this outgoing CEO's word for it. This is the highest stakes decision the board will make as a board. And so just to take someone's word for it isn't good governance.
Totally. It's interesting. One of the only things a board does is hire and fire the CEO. In terms of tactical operations, obviously there's ongoing governance and all sorts of other strategic planning things, but hiring and firing the CEO is often how boards end up getting measured in the long run. So you mentioned there's a disconnect potentially between the board. It's not their day job. They're not getting paid for it. They don't maybe know what the talent pool is like. Why do you think the default is to find an outside candidate being more attractive to boards?
I think it's just the grass is always greener syndrome. We get trapped in that as humans in every aspect of our lives. I think there's this sort of delulu. Is that what the kids say now? You're delulu if you're delusional, but delulu belief that there's just this whole queue of great charter school CEOs ready to move to Rochester or Little Rock, Arkansas. We just did a search there. And so, my gosh, we should go out and get one of those people. And I tell boards often, unicorns are not real, and I am not a magician. So let's be realistic about how many highly qualified candidates are actually going to be available right now to come to this city and run your schools.
Right. Totally. And I would imagine that's gotten even harder in a post-COVID era where remote work is more of an option. We saw so many families move to their hometown or, their dream location, and people, it seems, regardless of industry, are much more reticent to pick up and move their families. And so I think that's a really interesting point. Before we talk about some of the additional challenges of an outside candidate, because I want to stay on this outside candidate topic for a second, let's not paint it all in negative light before we go back to the challenges of an outside candidate. What are some of the strong positives that is good and appealing that boards may find attractive about outside, leaders?
Certainly just a fresh perspective, right? As someone who's coming in and may not be limited by what has happened in the past. They may have a bigger vision of excellence. I think a lot of times boards hope to find someone from a more established, potentially larger network where they've actually been invested in, right, as a leader. When you're working with these small charter schools, 1 school, 2 schools, 3 schools, I mean, they don't have a big network behind them where they can pour a bunch of money into investing in their leaders from a professional development standpoint. And so I think you go pull someone from a place like Uncommon Schools where, they do a ton of professional development. And I mean, I could list 5 or 6, right off the top of my head. Yeah, you're going to get somebody who has been, consciously or intentionally developed. Their leadership has been developed. And so I think that is a very positive thing that can come from an external candidate. We work with a lot of boards they're deep in turnaround mode. We got called because the school wants another year of data, not trending upward. You can find somebody who has a track record of a good to great or a terrible to good, transformation in terms of academic outcomes. We've placed some amazing people, external candidates that have gone in and done just tremendous things for kids. I just got an email a month ago about someone we placed 15 months ago. So he just had his first full school year, right, as a CEO. He was a first-time CEO. He came from a KIPP network to a much smaller network of charter schools. And he said it was the hardest thing he's ever done. And then he rattled off how achievement had gone up, ELA, math. He obviously had just gotten their data back from their test scores.
Right.
And that's exactly what the board wanted. And I was so proud to read that. And I'm usually the one who's reaching out to the placements and saying, how's it going? But to get an unsolicited email from a first-time CEO who just got some kick-ass results in the first year, that's exactly what a board is hoping for.
Yeah, so there are these kind of strong potential opportunities with outside candidates. I love the commentary about, if you've been part of a much larger organization where they've really poured into your development, if you can do it on a large scale, you can probably take some of those learnings to a smaller scale. And like you said, the fresh perspective is often what organizations need. But let's talk about where this goes wrong. Because if the default for a lot of boards is we're going to find our unicorn or our savior who's going to come in and fix all of our problems and they're going to move to our town, where do you see this go wrong? Maybe talk to us about some of the hurdles that you see outside candidates face that maybe an internal hire wouldn't have to deal with.
Well, I think the biggest initial challenge is that you're going to be doing this search for 4 to 6 months. And that just creates an environment of instability in the organization. And your staff are ripe to be picked off or to go elsewhere because they don't know who's going to be leading them next school year. So that's just a risk, right? If you're going to do a search, I go pick off people who are, they're in the middle of a CEO search. I'm going to call their COO and see if he or she wants to consider something else. So it's a real strategy for executive recruiters to go to organizations that are sort of don't have stable leadership at the moment. So I always caution boards about that when I talk to them. We think charter schools, everyone has their own unique twist, right? Their own take on it. And so sometimes you bring someone from the outside, it's hard to really have them, they haven't had the Kool-Aid, right? They haven't become really deeply invested in whatever the thing is that this charter school prides itself on or does. And so, for many years, the KIPP Foundation, when they sort of separated into all these different regions and they were now going to be running them with local control, they had a really hard time bringing in people from the outside. They just couldn't adapt to the uniqueness of the KIPP culture. Now, I would say, and with all love to KIPP, and I've done a ton of searches for their regions, their culture probably isn't as unique now as they have grown and other charter schools have come up, right? But at the time, they were one of the early charters. It was very difficult to bring someone in from the outside to have them run a region. And they had a really high failure rate. And taking over for a founder is tough because there's just that founder, people go and stay because of the founder, the cult of the founder personality. So sometimes that is difficult as well. Boards are not great at onboarding. So I always caution boards. We just wrapped a search for a CEO on Friday and talked to the board. And I said, look, I know you have process fatigue. We made you all come to Nashville to interview a bunch of candidates. I make you get on the phone every Friday at 3:00. You'd much rather be having a margarita, I'm sure. They're done. It's like, we're over it. They have process fatigue. And so I joke with them. I said, do not do the thing that boards are so tempted to do, which is to say, okay, welcome. We'll see you at the first board meeting. Who is the new CEO going to use to lean on? Like, who's their mentor? Who's their guide when they show up?
Here's the box of files. Good luck.
Yeah, can you imagine? What a nightmare. So I think these boards are just like, oh my God, the search is over. We're so excited for a new person. And then that's it. It ends. And so I've actually been toying with the idea of, just as part of our package, here's an onboarding plan that could work. You can adapt 80 to 85% of it, for any charter school CEO or ED, because a lot of these folks are first-time CEOs. It's real hard to get someone to make a lateral move. It's really hard to get someone who's already done that to come do it for an organization that's not bigger, right? And so again, with the whole Delulu thing of boards, I've had them ask me hilarious questions like, can you go get so-and-so? Okay, well, that person founded their own massive network. Why do you think they're going to want to come run this network, right? That's like,
right.
I already gave birth to this baby, but let me leave that baby here and come raise your baby, right? So it's just not realistic. And so I think 95% of the time, these placements are first-time CEOs. And the board has to lean in. They have to be willing to provide support to this person and have a reasonable onboarding plan. And really, I encourage boards to get coaches for their CEOs, at least for 6 months, but even a year is better. It's lonely at the top. It's a difficult thing. You can't go to your team and say, you can't go to your COO and say, oh, the CAO is really screwing up, right? That's not good management. You're going to go to your brand new board and say, I'm really struggling with whatever concept or issue. Now you're sort of tipping your hand that like, you're not perfect. And even though we all know none of us are perfect and there's no such thing as a perfect leader, a board probably doesn't want to hear that right out of the gate. So there just has to be an understanding of what the expectations are, and that boards need to allow these CEOs the freedom to make some mistakes and not have that be a complete freak out that they hired the wrong person.
Okay, so we've talked about outside candidates. We've talked about some of the potential positives as well as some of the potential challenges and sort of the integration process, the critical nature of the integration process being one of the foremost. Let's go back to the internal talent pool. The broader discussion here is what succession planning really looks like. Let's say I'm on a board and we've done zero succession planning, and we would like to go about evaluating internal successors. But if we're honest with ourselves, we fall into that category we talked about earlier in the conversation, which is we just don't really know what exactly the talent pool looks like. Where do we get started?
First thing you have to do is have an honest conversation with your existing leader about their goals, their long-term plans. Get real, right? They may have a desire to do something different in 3 years and 5 years. And I think there is a fear. The board, it's like, don't ask, don't tell. We don't want to know. We're just going to keep going on and just hope you're going to be here forever. And it's not realistic.
So you're saying we need to have this conversation now, even if our CEO is not leaving.
Correct.
Okay.
It's hard, but that's what we do. That's adulting, right? That's adulting 101 is we have difficult conversations. And so I think it's really important to have that conversation and just start opening the door a little bit. Second thing you can do right now is you do need an emergency succession plan. If your leader does not show up for work because the worst has happened, who will be in charge? And that needs to be explicitly determined. And that person, by the way, needs to be in on it. If the CEO meets his or her untimely demise, is it the chief academic officer? They should know that, and they should have access, like kind of emergency access to things that would be required in the case that the CEO isn't there. So I think that's really something that can be done right away, is like identify that person and then just sort of bring them along. Like, what would we need to do immediately if the worst were to happen? Who would be sort of in charge? Who would be running the ship? So I think that's another critical step. And it's something that you can just probably do in a board meeting, right? It's just name that person. And the third thing is, okay, I'm going to back up, because what I was going to say is the board has to hold the leader accountable for succession planning in their annual review. But I know for a fact some boards don't do an annual review at all of their CEO or executive director. So that's okay. You got to have an annual review. And part of what your CEO needs to be held accountable for is who they're developing to lead the organization and how. My dad always said he was an entrepreneur in human resources and human development. And he always said, people will be accountable to what you inspect and not what you expect. And so unless the board is saying, we're going to ask you every year, who's ready? What are you doing?
Right.
Who are you exposing? How are you doing it? That just needs to be part of the annual review process.
Totally.
And then the fourth thing, which would be integrated into the CEO kind of developing people underneath them and the board holding the CEO accountable, is the board needs to be exposed to the bench. Oftentimes, it's only the CEO, it's only the executive director at the board meetings. They're reporting out on finance, they're reporting out on academics, they're reporting out on operations. Let your team report out to the board on the pieces that they own. That will be a great intro for boards to start to get to know who is on the bench.
Right.
That's so basic and that's so easy. Just make that change at your next board meeting.
And potentially also provides more transparency amongst the operational executive team. If it's just the CEO who's controlling the narrative to the board, there's often a reason for that. And so getting more voices in the boardroom can sometimes be a good thing.
And that whole controlling the narrative, it's like the gatekeeper, right? The CEO is really the gatekeeper of what information the board is receiving.
Totally.
And I think that's a good practice. I think being transparent is a much better way to go about it. So those are just some really basic things you can do right away. I mean, succession planning on a more granular scale, there are consultants who will help bring like evaluative tools to it. I mean, there's all kinds of different leadership tests and things that will give insight into where a person is, sort of deficient and what they need to do to close those gaps. That requires a budget. That may take a little bit of time for a board, right? An organization to be able to reorient a budget and put money in there for specific succession planning and professional development that hasn't been there before. So that may be a little bit of a later step, but the first 3 or 4 things I mentioned, you can do immediately. If you do those things, you'll be way ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, it's not rocket science. It's things you can do low budget or beefier budget. So let's just recap those 4 quickly on cultivating internal talent pool. And you actually wrote an article about this that I thought was a great summary that we'll link to in the show notes. But just to recap those 4. So number 1 was start now, have the tough conversation. The second one was understanding the role of the CEO, getting to know the role of the CEO. Could you just talk about that one a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand with the evaluation of the CEO. I think it is a really good practice to have the CEO rewrite their job description every year as part of the review process. Again, we show up, there's no job description. There's nothing. Well, there should be. It's a job. You have a job. Let's put it on paper and define what it is. And you're 5 years into your role. It's not the same job that you were hired to do 5 years ago. And so if you as a board want to feel really plugged in to what the CEO does, have them write that job description every year and you all review it as part of the annual review process. And that just all works out beautifully because then you're kind of setting the expectations for the next year. You're setting the goals. There's always that tension when people are looking for a new leader between should they be an academic person who came up teacher, assistant principal, principal manager, now CEO. Well, yes. And that person is probably not going to have as much experience fundraising, managing a big budget, managing a board, right? Making important decisions about resource allocation and understanding what trade-offs are because there's not an endless amount of money in these schools. I think that is a crucial component is to know what the CEO is doing so you can kind of have a sense like of the profile. Now, a good search firm is going to help you like really dig deep. And I will ask the board on the 1-year anniversary of this person starting in the job, what is it that you're going to look to know if this person's been successful? And so I always frame it as if we all met up at the New Schools Venture Fund Conference or, the National Alliance for Charter Schools Conference, and here's the board, and here I am a year later, how would we know that we're all going to sit there and say, oh my gosh, let's toast, let's have a drink. Well done. This was an amazing hire, right? We're going to be so excited and so proud a year in. I push them to identify that. Otherwise, the job description is just a bunch of fluff, good manager, good communicator, high EQ. I mean, that's not that meaningful.
Right. Things that are going to be givens on any job description.
Yeah, exactly.
So boards really need to deeply understand the role of the CEO. The third one, as we're kind of wrapping up our 4 recommendations, is really investing in potential successors. You talked about this, having the CEO be accountable for, who are you developing? Who's next? Are there things that you feel like the board can do? Because obviously you can put the onus on the CEO to be cultivating potential leaders, giving them more responsibility. Are there ways you've seen boards be very intentional about investing in potential successors?
Yeah. I mean, if your board has committees, which they should, the head of the finance committee should be very well acquainted with the head of finance at the organization, right? And that should be a relationship that gets invested in. Same with the academic committee, and the chief academic officer. So, and we've all seen this won't be a surprise to anyone. There's just often a lack of engagement on the board. I mean, they come to the board meetings, but in between the board meetings, nothing's really happening. So how are your board members who have expertise in these various functions, how are they interacting with the person on the ground who's responsible for that work? Because they're going to be able to come and say, this is an excellent chief academic officer, or, this person is excellent at strategy or finance or whatever it may be. I mean, I think I put this in the article, but I've been on 3 charter school boards. It's very hard to recruit excellent board members, but you need a diverse set of skills on your board. Otherwise, you're not going to know what good talent looks like. And I mean, this is so common in the private sector. The board of Nike is going to be made up of other executives who have worked for consumer goods companies, right? Like consumer products companies, and who actually know the landscape and who's out there. So I think people need to I think there should be like crossover. I think people who are CEOs of, sort of competing charter management organizations or, upstate or downstate or one state over need to be on boards of other charter school organizations. That person's going to have the best perspective to bring. And, we pride ourselves on not being competitive. We're not like the private sector where we need to compete for profit. And especially if it's not like if you're crossing over, like not in the direct market,
Sure.
Right, that you're both working in,
Right.
There can be nothing but upside for that. And look, that's hard because the CEOs are going to tell you we're already working 60 hours a week. But I think there is an opportunity there that's missed because you have a bunch of folks on these boards who don't know anything about the business of education. They've never been educators. So you got to find a way to build out a board that has a really diverse set of skills. And you need people on there who know what good leadership looks like.
Totally. And then just to bring us to a wrap on these final 4 recommendations, we alluded to this earlier, but reclaiming the narrative and really promoting transparency. Do you think that there's an important role around succession narrative as it relates to internal versus external? We talked a lot about that. Could you maybe just speak to that for a second before we come to a close?
Sure. So I think the challenge and why boards feel compelled to do a national search is because there's not a lot of trust between the staff and the board because they don't know each other. The staff has never met the board. And for whatever reason, teachers, principals, staff, parents, they feel empowered to help choose the next leader of their school or their set of schools. And so you can't run a search that's not inclusive of all the stakeholders. You can't run a search that's not transparent. I wouldn't have a business, nor would my competitors, if we were trying to do everything sort of cloaked in secrecy. In the private sector, you show up for work one day and it's like, oh, hey, you have a new boss. That does not fly in our world. So oftentimes the board is really scared of making a mistake. They're scared of being seen as we're pushing this person forward without any real reason other than maybe this is just who the CEO wanted it to be or whatever. So, and it's a good practice to conduct a search. I'm not really advocating 100% of the time to not do a search because even if your internal candidate gets the job, they've won the job on merit and you've conducted a process that you can defend. That's one of my big overarching values when I talk to boards is you're not going to have 100% of your stakeholders all lined up behind the same candidate. But you should have 100% of your stakeholders say, this was a great process. It was transparent. It was inclusive. It was rigorous, right? So my person didn't get the job, but I really appreciate the way that the board went about it. And frankly, you need a search firm to do that because like I said, it's not the hardest job in the world. I'm not like a Mensa member or anything, but there is judgment that we have from doing this so many times and working with boards. That being said, there have been a couple of great examples of CEOs of pretty large networks starting the transition, sort of the succession process a couple of years in advance and really working with the board and saying, this is the candidate, and I'm going to take the next 2 years to sort of prepare them and expose them so that it's super natural. I mean, look, we can use modern day politics as the perfect example. When Joe Biden stepped down, no one knew for sure if he was going to throw his weight behind Kamala Harris, right? They were saying that there had to be a search. There had to be some kind of process that the delegates all got to nominate the candidate, and there had to be some kind of a competition. Well, I mean, that's how it works in a perfect world. But look, I mean, she was the successor. Everybody knew she was the one who had been by his side for 4 years. And I think and all the constituents and stakeholders have rallied behind her leadership, but you have to kind of make it that obvious to your stakeholders that this is my number 2 person. This is the person I trust the most to lead this organization in my absence. That doesn't happen in the 6-week period of time when you announce you're leaving and then leave. Like, oh, hey, by the way, I've got this great person over here. You guys are going to love her. She's ready to lead. It is much more intentional than that. And once you start talking about, like I said, reclaiming the narrative and exposing that person in an intentional way and building trust with all the different groups of stakeholders, right? Not just the principals, everyone, the board is a stakeholder, the community is a stakeholder, staff is a stakeholder, then it becomes much less likely that there's going to be a bunch of blowback when you don't conduct a search, don't hire a search firm. And now you've saved yourself like at least $75,000 and 4 months of instability.
So we're not actually putting Mollie out of business. We've come full circle.
I mean,
we put a bow on that nicely.
I know. So I have 56, so I probably should be thinking about retiring, but I love this.
Succession plan, Mollie. You need a succession plan.
Yeah, I have my own succession plan. So that's exactly right. Yeah.
So that's a perfect place to wrap. Where can people go if they want to learn more about you and K-12 Search Group?
Yep, K12searchgroup.com.
Cool. That's easy. What about resources for boards or CEOs or aspiring leaders? I'm guessing you get asked this all the time. Mollie, we want to educate our board better, or, I'm an aspiring CEO. I would love for you to come hunt me sometime. What are the resources or recommendations you have on that front?
Yeah, well, connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with other executive recruiters on LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn is a whole other podcast about how that's transformed executive search. But connect with us on LinkedIn. For boards about the succession planning, read the article that I published 4 years ago or whatever with the 74. But I will tell you, there are a lot of organizations and people smarter than me who have written about nonprofit succession planning. I think Bridgespan has a great set of resources that talk about how to succession plan as a nonprofit that are probably more lofty and, more research-based than Mollie Mitchell's opinion. But I think that's a good way, as a board to dig in and read some of the stuff that's been published by these are really credible organizations.
Great. Okay, awesome. Well, we'll link to some of that in the show notes. My last question for you, because I would be remiss not to ask this to an executive recruiter. Are there any roles you're filling right now that you would like to give a shout out to for potential listeners?
Oh my goodness. Well, we are just wrapping 2 big CEO searches. And so don't need any more candidates for that. But we are actively engaged in the search for a chief financial officer of Republic Schools that runs a great CMO in the South that serves students in Nashville and Jackson, Mississippi. And Ashley is a fantastic CEO. She's a total badass. I think there's a great opportunity there. And I will say it's remote.
Wow.
You don't have to live in Nashville or Mississippi. I know. So you get a chance to work with a killer team and you can work from home.
That's a pretty strong pitch.
Yeah. And that's my hottest tip of executive recruitment is if you can let the person be remote, you will have access to a far better talent pool. I mean, that should be obvious, but
right.
People still push back against it. In some positions, of course, you can't be, but for a CFO, I think you can.
The numbers are still the numbers. Yeah. And if you're interested, fun fact, episode 25, we had Trey Vernacey, who leads operations at Republic Schools. And you can go listen to that episode if you want some more insight into some of the cool things they're doing in operations at Republic Schools.
That's a great tip.
There you go. Well, Mollie, thanks again for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation. And to all those listening, go start your succession planning right now.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.